saw the prosperity here on earth, whereas in the New Testament, when we talk about Jesus talking about in heaven, that our goal is to get to heaven. We talk about it a lot more in the New Testament.
Right.
So, but we mustn't forget that he can still do the Old Testament punishments. I'm confused.
God's not into punishing. That's a human perspective of it. It seems that way. And it has to do with, think of it this way. When you were a child and your mother said, "Don't touch that stove," and you went near it and she smacked you on the behind, you thought that she was mean. Right? We're going to the doctors and you're going to get your shots. Right? You don't like that. That was mean, mommy, right? It was all for your good, right? As a child, you didn't understand that. Okay? And it was very much a kind of a punishment kind of relationship. You following me? That's the Old Testament. That's what you see in Sodom and Gomorrah. You see that in most of the Old Testament pannings out. It's not that God wasn't a God of love back then. He was. It looks different because humans were in a much less spiritually developed state. Does that make sense? Because this is a big problem a lot of the early Christians had, especially Greek converts, to understanding why does the God of the Old Testament look different than the God of the New Testament, where Jesus is all love and love and love and love. But in the Old Testament you get judgment and hail and fire and brimstone and all of this. And it's like, why the difference? And the answer is, from the fathers, is that it's because we were spiritual children back then and he had to treat us differently. He taught us differently. It took centuries of ingraining the law, the Old Testament law, into our hearts before he could take it to the level where we are now. Jesus mentioned this. You have heard that, could you divorce your wife at the time of Jesus? Yes. Why? Because there was a provision made in the Old Testament for that. And Jesus said, it wasn't because that was God's original idea. God hates divorce. But he put that provision in there because of the hardness of your heart. But in the beginning, it was not so. He made them man and woman and caused them, and the two will become one. That's probably the best example I can get to you to understand the difference between that. It's like, could they divorce their wives during the time of Jesus? Yes. Was it a part of the law? Yes. Was it a good law? No. It was put in there provisionally because what was the alternative? See, you don't understand that back in the day of Moses, when Moses was alive, if you didn't like your wife, you just kill her. You just kill her and find another. Next. And there was nothing to be said about it. No one blinked an eye. The fact that there were divorce laws under the Old Testament showed that God was trying to stop that kind of brutality. Like also in the Old Testament, here's another good example. In the Old Testament, you heard it was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But what does Jesus say? Love your enemies. And that seems like why the difference? Why not just say love your enemies back in the Old Testament? Well, the reason is because back in the Old Testament, it was sort of like the gangs of LA. It is. You had this clan versus this clan. And this clan looked at this guy wrong. And so he comes back and punches him. Well, this guy ain't going to hold that. He's going to come back and punch him more. Well, they're not going to stand, and they're going to punch him, and that, and that, and that, and that. Blood feuds that would go on for generations. Not much more than, like I said, the gangs of LA doing that. Fighting over, I'm not going to hit you, I'm going to hit you harder. Oh yeah, well we're going to hit you, we're going to hit you harder. Oh yeah, we're going to hit you, we're going to hit you, and on and on and on. So when God instituted the eye for an eye and the tooth for a tooth law, it was to say, look, this is how you dispense justice. If someone hits you, an eye gets an eye. A tooth for you don't hit them more. You get it? And it took centuries to instill that kind of civility into the human soul before Jesus can say, okay, now that you've got that kind of good, let's take it one step further. Love your enemies. Someone hits you on the right cheek, what are you supposed to do?
Give the other.
You don't respond back. You see that? It's because that is the level of spiritual maturity and it took centuries to develop this. Centuries. Because they still lived under these kind of blood feuds and so forth. Chris, then Ludi, then Tony, and then maybe we'll get to Revelation.
Into what you just said. In today's reading, I think it's the first reading, Genesis, if I recall very well, there was a story of Abraham and Lot.
Mm-hmm.
And Lot wanted so much, and even his livestock and so on and so forth. And Abraham was of the opinion of peace, of a way to make peace. And there was an instance of, okay, if you do not agree with me in sharing and living in peace, maybe you should move to this part of town. And he gave all that option. Lot chose to move to, I think, the Jordan part of town.
He moved to the plains of Sodom and Gomorrah, yes.
Yes, while Abraham stayed where he was.
In the desert. Right. Mm-hmm.
So I think what I'm trying to say is that before Jesus, there's been some samples of those who actually were looking for that peace instead of kill or be killed.
Yes. Yes.
Live and let live, sort of. So
yes.
Abraham struck me as the beginning, the path.
Yes. And because he was a man already called by God, he wouldn't have done that on his own. Okay. That's the idea. God had already called Abraham. He had already moved him out of Ur. He had already been to the land of promise, and he was working on Abraham to get him into trusting in him, to give him this progeny that he still hadn't seen yet. And so that is how God affected him. So yes, and that's why Abraham is such a great man of faith, because he went beyond that. Ludi.
Okay. The thing of it is, I think God gave response to senses, because if you remember in the Old Testament, Moses and God were talking to each other.
Yes.
And then so God finally said, I'm going to send my only son, and then down just the beginning and the end.
That was, the coming of Jesus was the culmination of everything from Adam until that point, to rectify the problems that sin had wrought into the world. That's the short answer.
Yes. In the Old Testament, most of the book written by Moses, called the Torah of Moses, and
Yes.
the law of Moses, that people still did not change. The sin still in their flesh. That's why God made a new covenant.
Correct.
Called Torah of Jesus. That's called Torah of Jesus. That means a new covenant, and the new covenant is different. The love of God to the people is still the same love with the new people in the new covenant. The way that you see the killing, the harsh rule, law, things like that, it doesn't cut sin. People still sin. How many times God said, do not adultery, do not idolatry, do not worship other God. But even Solomon, at the end of his age, his foreign wife turned his heart, and then he worshipped those foreign gods.
Correct.
See that? So the Torah of Moses is not strong enough to keep sin from their flesh. So that's why God sent His own Son.
Yes.
In John chapter 3:16, Johnson, because the love of God is sent out. And the love has never changed from the beginning at the end.
That's a very good point, is that even in the Old Testament, the number one commandment was to love God with all of your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. That was embedded in there, because when Jesus was confronted by it, he said, what is the greatest of the laws? And that was that. So it was in there, but it was, if you will, so buried under all the other laws because people were unable, because of sin, to fulfill that in the way that is possible now because of the coming of Jesus. So, what the law did was to train us to be, on a very basic human level, more civil to one another. The wisdom of the law of the Old Testament over the pagan law at the same time is that it was a far more civilizing force than the Code of Hammurabi, for example, which still would allow you to kill your wife, permitted adultery, things like that. And that was purely out of human law. It would still say don't steal, don't kill, but it would make provisions in all of this. So it's, you see what I'm saying? And it's very much like training up children. You don't tell a child the same kind of restrictions as you do as a teenager, because they're more mature. And that's the difference between the Old and the New Testaments. That is the basic difference between the Old and the New Testament. Is it fast, Robert?
Very.
All right.
The fact that, you were saying we're kind of moved from one over time into now. The thing is what's embedded now in children is already in their hearts of what is right and wrong. They don't have to be, they can be refined. Okay, now, you go out in the yard, 5-year-old and 6, playing in the sand, they know it's wrong. They know that they shouldn't do that. They can do it themselves. I think that as well, talking about not knowing and having to be raised and way back in the old ones, that's now embedded to us.
And that's part of God's plan of salvation, yes, is that from the time of Adam until the time of Moses, people had a sense of understanding of what is right and wrong. But because of sin, it was not enunciated, as it says in the book of Romans. It says, when sin came into the world, it wasn't recognized until there was the law. Yet people died in just the same because of sin from the time of Moses, from Adam until Moses. All the law did was to point out, this is what you should do and what you shouldn't do. It was a teacher. It was never meant to be the way in which we become holy. It was a teacher pointing us to the way. Because Jesus comes and says, the law is all good, and he's not going to take anything from it. In fact, he's come to fulfill it. But it was insufficient. And I'll tell you how insufficient it is. You have heard that it was said, do not kill, but I'll tell you, don't hate your brother. You have heard that it was said, don't commit adultery. I tell you what? Don't lust for a woman with your mind. You have heard that it was said, do not lie. But I tell you, don't make foolish oaths. You see that? The whole Sermon on the Mount is the idea of taking what was in the Old Testament and amping it up. Because it's like it's insufficient. Sin has to be dealt with. Otherwise, you cannot be the persons that God expects you to be. You cannot. That's why you need a Savior. Because we are impotent in our own power to do it. We need God. We need His sacraments. We need His grace. And that dependency is what causes us to be turned into saints. far greater than what they were in the Old Testament.
I have one last point.
One last point.
Yeah. Every chapter in every chapter in the Old Testament, God always stress obedient. Genesis, obedient. Adam didn't. See that? That is evil is truth.
Yes.
So disobedient. And continue with Exodus, continue with Numbers, continue with Judges and Samuel. every single chapter, right? Every single chapter.
Yes.
God said what? I am the Lord your God. There is no other God before me. You cannot put other God before me. In Isaiah, he said, where other God? Is there any other God? How come I don't know? If there's any other God, I will know. But there's no other God. Where's other God? And you keep going and worship other God. I am the Lord your God. See, they keep it. And what Jesus said, still the same thing. And the love from God to the people, still the same thing. God still, even though God punished or God warned, but still, like 40 years in the desert, God said that, who gives you the bread every single day? And you don't want bread, you want meat, the quail come down for you to eat. The sandal didn't go out, your clothes didn't torn.
Yes.
See that how hard you say that God is not a loving God. Right. And so Jesus come down with the same thing, the same message.
Yes.
The same message. That's why at the end of the Old Testament, God said, from now on I'm going to put the law upon your hand and write in your heart, so I can be your God and you can be my people.
Yes, because it was insufficient the way it was. And that's what the sufficiency of Jesus is. He gives us His Holy Spirit to make us into the people that He wants us to be. And with that, we're going to Revelation 8, come hell or high water. All right. Last we heard chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. There's this brief part where we see some of the liturgy in heaven. And we spoke about that a couple of weeks ago. About the, verse 1. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for a half an hour.